Welcome to Arsenal, where the weapons and war machines of military history come to life. Today, we explore Fletcher-class destroyers in the Pacific War and the crews and opponents who gave them their reputation. If you enjoy learning how technology, tactics, and human decisions come together in combat, you can find more articles, podcasts, and resources at trackpads.com. Dawn hangs as a gray smear over the Philippine Sea, but on the destroyer's bridge, the world has already turned white and orange. Shell splashes march steadily closer, tall columns of water bracketing the American escort carriers off Samar. The men on the Fletcher-class destroyer Johnston can now make out the shapes on the horizon, cruisers and battleships, and clouds of muzzle flashes from a Japanese force they were never meant to face in a direct surface duel. Arsenal is the Friday feature of Dispatch United States Military History magazine, and here it rides with one of those destroyers into that desperate fight. The scene is bright, violent, and far more than a simple escort mission gone wrong. The ship is already pushing past her designed flank speed, the hull shuddering as she turns into yet another spread of incoming fire. On the bridge, orders are shouted, repeated back, and turned instantly into motion down below. Boiler rooms force steam into the turbines that drive the shafts and propellers, the unseen muscle that keeps the bow pointed where the captain needs it. Handling rooms take the strain as men haul powder and shells up to the 5-inch guns on deck. Forward mounts answer with rapid fire that claws at the silhouettes of much larger ships, each blast a concussive punch that hammers through steel decks and human ribs alike. Torpedo men crouch at their tubes, waiting for the one shouted order that means the captain has committed to a run. Around them, the destroyer lays down smoke, long white clouds meant to hide the vulnerable escort carriers that are already drawing back to the east. Japanese gunners adjust to this new picture, and their shells begin to plunge into the fringes of the American screen, tearing water and steel apart at the same time. Above, carrier aircraft from the small escort carriers dive and climb through the chaos. Some have no bombs left at all and make dry runs simply to distract gunners and break enemy concentration. Inside this chaos, the Fletcher is doing exactly what her designers once hoped a new destroyer could do when the plans were still lines on paper. She can sprint at high speed, throw out enough smoke to shield bigger ships, and strike above her weight with both guns and torpedoes. Her radar gives her eyes beyond the horizon and through poor visibility, and her speed and handling give her options earlier destroyers simply did not have at these ranges. This new blend of firepower, sensing, and maneuver gives the captain choices, even against a larger battle line. In every quick course change and salvo, the class shows what it was built to offer the fleet. Yet the scale of the force off Samar shows the limits of even a capable destroyer. A handful of ships like Johnston now find themselves charging a formation that includes battleships and heavy cruisers, weapons whose shells can unmake a destroyer with a single hit. The mission has narrowed down to survival and delay, to buying time for the escort carriers and the troops ashore who depend on them. Each turn of the wheel, each torpedo fired, is part of that larger gamble. This moment, with destroyers driving in against a battle line, becomes the sharpest possible test of a class that had been built for a more controlled vision of how the Pacific War would unfold. A decade earlier, the United States Navy had pictured a very different kind of war at sea. Interwar planners imagined long-range operations across the Pacific, but they worked inside the tight bounds of naval treaties that held displacement and armament in check. Destroyers of the 1930s were lean, fast ships that could screen battleships and carriers, run at high speed, and launch torpedoes, but they were also crowded with compromises. As new anti-aircraft guns, sonar sets, and radar gear appeared, there was simply not enough room or weight margin to fit them all without painful trade-offs. Something had to give if the fleet wanted a destroyer that could absorb all of this equipment and still remain safe and effective. Early fighting in the Pacific exposed these weaknesses harshly. Japanese surface forces relied on powerful, long-range torpedoes and aggressive night tactics in confined waters such as Iron Bottom Sound. United States ships needed better gunnery control, more reliable sensors, and the ability to fight both day and night against aircraft, submarines, and surface ships at the same time. Older destroyer classes did not have the endurance for sustained operations with fast carrier task forces that ranged thousands of miles from major bases. Crew spaces were already cramped and hot, and every extra ton of wartime equipment pushed stability closer to the edge. The Navy wanted a destroyer that could do much more than simply escort and screen heavy units. It needed a true multi-role workhorse that could steam long distances at high speed, throw a heavy torpedo broadside, put up a meaningful anti-aircraft umbrella over the ships it guarded, hunt submarines with serious tools, and still survive the punishment of rough Pacific seas. Industrial strength at home offered a way forward. With treaty limits fading as war loomed, designers finally had the political and technical room to think bigger, in the most literal sense. The Fletcher-class destroyer emerged from this mix of frustration and ambition. She was conceived as a larger and more flexible hull that could carry the weapons, sensors, and fuel needed for a two-ocean navy at war. The decision to build her in large numbers reflected a clear judgment from the Navy that the fleet needed a destroyer that could keep up with aircraft carriers, stand in formation with cruisers, and still answer the daily grind of convoy escort, shore bombardment, and patrol. The jump from earlier designs to the Fletcher line was not just a slow evolution in steel. It was a deliberate attempt to solve a growing list of problems with one adaptable, repeatable platform that could be turned out in quantity and trusted in almost every role at sea. In the late 1930s and early war years, officers and engineers sat over drawing boards and conference tables trying to escape the limits of the previous decade. Earlier American destroyers had been squeezed into treaty tonnage, and everyone knew the bill for that compromise was coming due at sea. There was little reserve weight or space left for radar sets, more anti-aircraft guns, or improved fire control directors. The designers wanted a clean break, a new hull that would begin with a strong armament and still have room to grow as wartime demands changed. They accepted that this meant a larger ship that would burn more fuel and use more steel, and they judged that extra cost a fair trade for flexibility and endurance. Every feature on the plans reflected a choice. A longer hull promised higher sustained speed and better seakeeping in Pacific swells, which mattered for ships expected to run with fast carrier task forces. But it also risked a bigger target profile and more structural stress over years of hard steaming. Heavier anti-aircraft batteries would help protect carriers and transports under attack, yet every extra mount added topside weight and another handful of men to serve it. Designers weighed a powerful torpedo armament against the need for depth charge racks, sonar gear, and later a head-throwing anti-submarine weapons that would demand deck space of their own. From a distance, the finished ship would look simple and clean, but under the skin, she was a crowded, carefully argued design where almost everything had a reason. Seen at a glance, a Fletcher-class destroyer was an American fleet destroyer of the Second World War built for the United States Navy as an all-purpose escort and attack ship. She displaced around 2,000 tons on a standard load, enough to carry serious armament and fuel without moving into cruiser territory. Her crew started at roughly 270 men and grew to well over 300 as new weapons, sensors, and fittings crowded aboard over the course of the war. 5 5-inch dual-purpose guns formed her main gun battery, able to fire at both surface targets and aircraft, while 10 21-inch torpedo tubes gave her a heavy punch in a night surface action. At flank speed, she could make about 35 knots and had the fuel to range across the vast Pacific while still keeping station with fast carrier groups. Once the Navy accepted the design, production turned into a test of industrial muscle as much as naval engineering. Shipyards on the Atlantic and Pacific coasts and along the Gulf laid down keels, launched hulls, and commissioned new destroyers in a steady drumbeat. Standardized machinery and weapons made it possible to build in such numbers, because engines, guns, and many fittings could be ordered and installed in familiar patterns. Even so, each yard left small fingerprints and details of layout and finish, subtle differences that crews came to know. By the middle years of the war, Fletcher-class destroyers formed the backbone of the destroyer force, present at nearly every major operation from the Solomons through the Central Pacific Drive to Okinawa, proof that the decisions made on paper had become a practical, repeatable weapon at sea. From the outside, a Fletcher in service presented a lean, purposeful profile that told a practiced eye what she was built to do. A raised bow carried a single 5-inch gun that looked out over the sea and gave the ship a clear forward bite. Behind it, a run of deck held another gun mount and the forward bank of torpedo tubes, the tools for close surface work. 2 raked funnels and a lattice of masts and directors marked the ship's middle, the visible signs of the machinery and fire control brains inside. Aft, more gun mounts and depth charge gear crowded the decks, while the long hull rode Pacific swells with enough length for a decent gun platform, but not so much that she became slow to turn. It was a compromise between a stable firing base and a knife that could still twist quickly in the water. Inside that shell, life and work centered on a few critical spaces. High on the forward superstructure, the open bridge and the enclosed wheelhouse formed the world of the captain and the officer of the deck. From there, they could see the sea, read wind and wave patterns, and talk directly with lookouts and signalmen scanning the horizon for friend and foe. Just behind and a little lower sat the Combat Information Center, usually darkened, crowded with radar scopes, plotting tables, and tangles of voice circuits. In that room, young officers and enlisted operators turned raw blips, bearings, and reports into a living mental map of the fight, a picture that guided every turn of the helm and every decision about where to bring the guns and torpedoes to bear. It was the ship's nervous system in action. Below the waterline, the engineering plant provided the unglamorous but essential muscle for everything the crew tried to do topside. Boiler rooms raised steam that flowed to the turbines in the adjacent engine rooms, which in turn drove the twin shafts and screws that pushed the ship through the water. Watch teams of firemen, machinists' mates, and electricians worked in hot, noisy compartments where the sound of machinery never really stopped, even in off hours. The layout split the plant into separate units, so that a single hit or mechanical failure would not automatically leave the ship dead in the water. Damage control teams practiced isolating flooding, rerouting power and steam, and keeping at least some propulsion and weapons working even after serious damage. That training mattered when real shells and torpedoes shattered pipes and frames instead of harmless drill cards. The weapons side of the ship wrapped around these living and working spaces like a shell around an egg. The 5-inch dual-purpose guns sat in their mounts with a director overhead, and in later years that system gained radar ranging to improve accuracy in poor visibility. Those guns could loft shells up against aircraft or fire flat at surface targets, giving the destroyer flexibility in every fight. Torpedo crews tended the centerline mounts, keeping tubes and warheads ready, so that when the order came, they could swing the racks outboard and fire a spread in seconds. As the war went on and the air threat grew sharper, extra 40mm and 20mm anti-aircraft weapons multiplied along the decks. Every spare patch of steel seemed to sprout shields, ready rounds, and still more men to serve them. At the stern and along the sides, depth charge racks and projectors, and later ahead, throwing anti-submarine weapons, gave the crew tools to hunt submarines as well as engage surface and air threats. For the men aboard, the destroyer was both weapon and home, and the two roles were impossible to separate. Mess decks where sailors ate also served as recreation spaces when the watchbill and the sea allowed a moment to relax. Berthing compartments were cramped and often hot, yet sailors who had known earlier, smaller destroyers still recognized them as an improvement. Communication in action relied on sound-powered telephones, voice tubes, and short, clear orders repeated up and down the chain until everyone knew what was happening. Training ashore and in peacetime exercises had taught clean procedures and textbook formations. But veterans remembered how real combat in heavy weather, under air attack, or in confused night actions forced them to adapt, improvise, and work around battle damage. Inside a Fletcher-class destroyer, every station from the bridge to the engine rooms depended on all the others, and the class's reputation grew from how well those human links kept the machinery fighting under strain. The story of the Fletcher-class in action reaches a peak off Samar, and that fight sits inside a wider pattern of combat that shows how this design worked under fire. The destroyer charge in October 1944 unfolded inside the Battle of Leyte Gulf, a sprawling effort to secure the invasion of the Philippines. The escort carrier group known as Taffy 3 was never meant to stand toe-to-toe with battleships and heavy cruisers, yet that is exactly what happened when a Japanese surface force slipped through the straits and fell upon the lightly protected carriers. Fletcher-class destroyers such as Johnston, Hull, and Heermann suddenly found themselves between the giants and the thin-skinned escort carriers that carried the air power for the landing beaches. In that moment, their mission became brutally simple: to draw fire, buy time, and disrupt the enemy formation in any way they could. The sequence of the fight showed both the strengths and limits of the design. The destroyers laid smoke to hide the carriers, then sprinted out of their own cover to fire torpedoes at the closing heavy ships. 5-inch guns worked as fast as crews could load, raked enemy superstructures, gun mounts, and bridges in an effort to blind and confuse larger opponents. At ranges where the Japanese heavy guns should have dominated, the smaller ships stayed alive with constant maneuver and a steady rain of return fire. Distances shrank from tens of thousands of yards to brawling range, and each turn of the wheel became a gamble between presenting a smaller target and keeping torpedoes or guns bearing on the enemy. This brutal morning near Leyte was not the first time Fletchers had met the enemy at close quarters. In the Solomons campaign, they had already traded blows in chaotic night battles, using radar-directed gunnery and torpedoes to contest waters where Japanese long-range torpedoes had once ruled almost unopposed. Off Guadalcanal, at Cape St. George, and in countless lesser-known engagements, the class earned a reputation as a hard-hitting and hard-working destroyer that commanders trusted for difficult jobs. They screened larger ships, raided enemy waters, and fought surface actions in narrow seas that punished any error. Leyte Gulf turned that running record into legend because the stakes were so stark and the odds so uneven. By the time the fighting off Samar ended, some Fletcher-class ships lay on the bottom, their hulls torn open by shells and torpedoes they could not withstand. The escort carriers and the troops depending on them were still in the fight, though, and that outcome traced directly back to what those destroyer crews had done under fire. Their speed, torpedoes, and gunnery had punched far above their size, forcing a much stronger enemy to break off instead of finishing the carriers. The baptism of fire for the class did not happen in one single battle, but the charge off Samar has become the symbol of how these ships could change the course of a larger campaign. It was the kind of action that burned itself into the memory of everyone on both sides who watched it unfold. Ask the men who lived and worked aboard these ships, and certain strengths emerge again and again in their stories. Fletcher-class destroyers were fast and could sustain high speeds in heavy seas, which mattered enormously in the wide Pacific, where distances were measured in days of steaming. They were good seaboats, rolling and pitching, but rarely feeling fragile, and their long hulls gave gunners and directors a relatively stable platform even when the weather turned bad. Crews valued the 5-inch dual-purpose guns, which combined useful reach with a rapid rate of fire, and appreciated that the original design left room for more anti-aircraft weapons and electronics as the war progressed. By destroyer standards, there was also a measure of comfort, still cramped and hot, but a clear step up from the even tighter earlier classes. Those same choices brought weaknesses that sailors had to live with. To get the desired speed and range, the design sacrificed armor almost entirely, which meant even a single well-placed shell or torpedo could cause catastrophic damage. As the war went on and more anti-aircraft mounts, radar sets, and fittings crowded the decks, some ships felt top-heavy and wet forward, shipping water in rough weather and making life miserable on the bow. Crew numbers swelled as new equipment arrived, straining living spaces and making every compartment more crowded, noisier, and hotter. Maintainers had to keep complex machinery and delicate electronics running around the clock, often far from major repair bases and with only the spares they could carry on board. Bridge and superstructure shapes also evolved as lessons filtered back from the fleet. Some ships were built or modified with different bridge configurations to improve visibility, reduce silhouettes, or make space for new fire control equipment. Radar sets improved rapidly, and the Combat Information Center grew in importance, absorbing more of the ship's intellectual workload as new screens, repeaters, and plotting tools appeared. Anti-submarine gear followed a similar path, expanding from basic depth charge racks and throwers to include more sophisticated sonar and, in the post-war years, ahead-throwing weapons and rocket-assisted systems. These additions turned the destroyer into a more serious submarine hunter as well as a surface and anti-aircraft escort. The success of the Fletcher concept pushed designers to take further steps. Follow-on classes such as the Allen M. Sumner and Gearing destroyers built on the idea of a large and flexible hull with strong dual-purpose armament and enough space for future growth. In the years after 1945, many Fletcher-class ships were modernized rather than scrapped, receiving new anti-submarine weapons, updated radar, and improved living spaces in programs that kept them active into the early Cold War. Other ships were transferred to Allied navies, where local modifications and refits reflected different tactical needs and budget realities, but the core hull and internal layout remained recognizable to anyone who had served on the original American ships. Through all these changes, the class showed how a sound basic design could absorb new technology and missions while keeping its character. The Fletcher hull and internal arrangement accommodated radar, more anti-aircraft guns, new sonar, and altered command spaces without losing the destroyer's essential agility and reach. That adaptability is part of why the class lasted so long and appeared under so many flags. It also explains why naval architects and officers later treated the Fletcher as an example of how to design a ship that could grow without becoming unmanageable. In the post-war period, Fletcher-class destroyers continued to serve in conflicts such as the Korean War and in Cold War patrols around the globe. Many of them sailed in updated forms that carried far more electronics and anti-submarine gear than their wartime designers had imagined possible. Even after they left frontline service, they remained present in training roles and in foreign fleets, extending their influence through the officers and sailors who learned their craft aboard them. Later generations of destroyers, bristling with guided missiles and advanced sensors, still reflected ideas first proven on these relatively simple gun and torpedo ships. However the story is told, the closing note remains the same. Behind every clean hull line and neat row of gun mounts were hundreds of sailors whose lives depended on how well this class performed when it mattered most. Their courage, skill, and endurance turned design choices into real outcomes in battles such as the Solomons Campaign and Leyte Gulf. The steel and machinery gave them a chance, but the human side determined how that chance played out under fire. You can also hear narrated versions of Arsenal features as part of the Trackpads podcast feeds and Dispatch audio editions. A reminder that these ships and their crews still have stories to share with anyone willing to listen.